My name is Evelyn Carter. I once wore the Navy uniform and carried its weight through dust and blood. I served as a medical officer in combat zones where the air smelled of burning metal and the cries of the wounded never seemed to end. I stitched together lives in places the world had already written off, and I carried those memories home with me. Yet at my own family table, I was reduced to a shadow. To them, I was the one who had failed, the one who had nothing to show. They called me lazy, as if the silence I carried was proof of weakness. And then one night, at a family celebration filled with laughter and wine glasses clinking, someone rose to their feet, looked straight at me, and gave me the salute reserved for honor. The room went quiet. That single gesture shifted everything. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if stories of courage and resilience speak to you. Share in the comments where you are listening from and what hour it is in your corner of the world. It is always moving to see how far these stories travel and whose hearts they reach. What you are about to hear is not only about rejection and betrayal within my own bloodline. It is also about the quiet strength of a woman who once served, who came home carrying invisible wounds, and who found that silence could be its own kind of defiance. In the end, my family was forced to see me differently, not because I demanded it, but because truth has a way of breaking through. Sometimes the loudest recognition comes not in applause or medals, but in a simple salute at the right moment. I came home from the Navy with a body still strong, but a mind that sometimes felt like it had been left behind in a desert half a world away. The war does not come back with you in uniforms or flags or medals. It comes back in pieces. The way a sudden noise can set your chest on fire. The way you sit in the corner of a crowded room, mapping exits before you notice faces. The way your dreams are never yours anymore, but reruns of surgeries under a flickering light. The sound of choppers overhead, the metallic smell of blood refusing to wash off your hands. I tried to slip into civilian life the way you slide into an old coat, but it never fit quite right. Instead of camo, I wore scrubs and lab coats at a biomedical research facility outside Norfolk. My work there was quiet, confidential, the kind of research that never made headlines but saved lives downrange. I learned to live in silence, carrying my service like a folded flag pressed against my chest. But in my family's eyes, silence looked like failure. My father was a Marine, the kind who believed worth was proven in noise and spectacle. His stories were told in the language of medals and campaigns, of boot camps and parades. My brother followed that same pattern, though he chose a badge instead of a uniform. Officer Carter, the pride of the town. My sister, the youngest, married into money and privilege. She showed off her big house the way others show off children's drawings. At the table, her husband's name was spoken with reverence, his every promotion a headline in our small family paper. When I sat down at the table, I felt invisible. The first time my father looked at me across those plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes and asked, "What is it you even do these days, Evelyn?" I felt the words burn into my chest. He asked it casually, with his fork still in hand as if it were small talk, but silence followed his question. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Everyone waited. I opened my lips, but nothing came out. I could not explain without betraying the oath I had taken to protect the details of my work. I could not tell them that in a sealed lab, we were running simulations on battlefield wounds, testing new blood-clotting agents that might one day mean the difference between a soldier making it home or being zipped into a body bag. I could not tell them that some of my research was classified, linked to protocols that even doctors in civilian hospitals would never see. So I simply said, "I'm working in biomedical research." The words fell flat like a spoon dropped on the floor. My brother laughed. My sister raised her brows as if I had said I was knitting scarves for stray cats. My mother, always the peacekeeper, poured more gravy into someone's plate and changed the subject. My father leaned back in his chair and muttered something about real jobs. The sting of that moment never left me. It happened again and again, meal after meal. Gathering after gathering, every time I sat at that table, the spotlight turned toward my siblings. My brother told stories of arrests made and lives saved on the streets. My sister boasted about her husband's promotions, his growing collection of medals framed on the wall of their house. Applause circled the table, heads nodded, glasses clinked. When the attention shifted to me, it always ended with the same question. "So, Evelyn, what do you do with yourself these days?" I learned to hate that question. I wanted to shout. I wanted to slam my hand down and tell them about the nights in Iraq when I held pressure on a wound for hours until my arms shook. I wanted to tell them about the men whose hearts stopped twice in my hands, only to breathe again because I refused to quit. I wanted to tell them about the soldier who clutched a rosary in one hand and my sleeve in the other as I promised he would see his wife again. But those stories did not belong at the table. They belonged to the men who had lived or died through them. They belonged to the war that never fully came home, so I swallowed them whole and kept them locked inside. The chairs at the family table became markers of distance. My father at the head, speaking with pride about the son who patrolled the streets. My mother next to him, smiling, nodding, refilling glasses. My sister across from me. Diamond ring catching the light as she spoke about galas and fundraisers. And then there was my chair, always a little too quiet, always empty, even when I sat there. Sometimes I wondered if they noticed the way I pushed food around my plate, the way my gaze drifted to the window, the way my hands trembled when the laughter grew too loud. Maybe they saw, and maybe they chose not to, because if they had seen, truly seen, they might have recognized the ghost of the battlefield sitting at their table. Instead, they chose the easier story. Evelyn is the one who never quite made it. Evelyn is the one who sits at home while the rest of us build real lives. Evelyn is the one who needs saving. The cruelty of it was that while they dismissed me, they lined on me in silence. It was my account that paid the bill when my brother made a mistake he could not fix. It was my research grant money that helped cover my mother's medical expenses when insurance ran thin. It was my time spent babysitting, tutoring, showing up. That allowed my sister to shine in her circle. They took from me without ever seeing me. That is the kind of hurt that cuts deepest. Not strangers overlooking you, but the people who should know you best choosing not to. One evening, after yet another dinner where my brother boasted about a dangerous arrest and my sister compared designer handbags, my father leaned back, wine glass in hand, and looked straight at me. "Some of us serve," he said, his voice heavy with pride for himself, for my brother-in-law, and some of us live off the rest. The table laughed, not cruelly but knowingly, as if it were a joke already told too many times. My mother winced, said nothing. I smiled a practiced smile, the one that held back the storm inside. But that night when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I remembered another table, a folding table in a tent overseas, where I sat with 6 soldiers whose lives I had patched together only hours before. They looked at me like I was a miracle, though I knew I was only flesh and bone trying to hold back death with stitches and gauze. They offered me the first hot meal I had seen in days, their laughter awkward and grateful, their eyes carrying the weight of lives almost lost. At that table I was seen. At that table I mattered. The contrast hollowed me out. By the time dawn broke, I understood something I had not wanted to admit. In my family's home, there would always be empty chairs. Even if I sat in one, I would never truly belong. In the years after I came home, I learned that war does not end with a homecoming. It lingers in the small details, in the shadows of an ordinary life. Civilians think of battlefields as explosions and firefights, but for me the battlefield reappeared in the whir of a ceiling fan that reminded me of helicopter blades. It reappeared in the acrid scent of fireworks on the 4th of July, in the sudden crack of a car backfiring on a city street. It even reappeared in silence, the kind so deep that it echoed like the long pauses between mortar fire. I carried these ghosts quietly. At work in the lab, I found a rhythm, something steady to hold on to. Each vial, each data point, each sterile room gave me a measure of control that the battlefield never had. In the long hours under fluorescent lights, I could almost forget the desert sun baking my skin, the way dust clung to every pore. Science gave me order where memory had left only chaos. But when I left the lab and returned to family gatherings, I walked into a different kind of battlefield. Holidays were the hardest. Thanksgiving tables heavy with turkey and pie, Christmas mornings with glittering lights, birthdays with candles waiting to be blown out. In theory, these were moments of joy, of togetherness. For me, they were stages where I played the role of the family disappointment. The script rarely changed. My brother, in his crisp uniform or pressed shirts, always had a story ready, a robbery thwarted, a life saved, a commendation from his department. My father's eyes lit with pride, his voice booming as he told my brother to share every detail again for the relatives who had just arrived. Applause followed, glasses were raised. My brother leaned back in his chair, basking in the light of recognition. Then came my sister's turn. Her husband, a rising officer in the Air Force, had medals pinned on his chest. Photographs with commanders framed on their walls. My sister's voice dripped with pride as she listed each promotion, each new posting. Her stories were wrapped in luxury: the gala she attended, the charity ball she hosted, the vacation she planned. My mother sighed with delight at each detail. My father nodded with approval. And then, without fail, eyes turned to me. "So, Evelyn, what about you?" Sometimes it came from my father, sometimes my brother, sometimes a relative who had not seen me in months. The words were innocent on the surface, but beneath them lay expectation, a dare, a demand for proof. And every time I gave the same small answer: "I am working in biomedical research." It sounded thin against the weight of uniforms and medals and framed photographs. It sounded invisible, like a shadow of a real career. And in that moment the air shifted. My brother smirked, my sister sipped her wine, my father cleared his throat and moved on. There were no claps for me, no raised glasses, no light in my parents' eyes. What they never saw was the way my hands shook when I cut into a roast, because it reminded me of emergency surgeries on makeshift tables. What they never knew was that I woke at 2 in the morning, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, as if mortars had landed outside my window. They never saw me pause in a grocery store aisle, paralyzed by the scent of antiseptic that sent me reeling back into a tent where a young soldier had slipped through my fingers. They thought I sat at home doing nothing. But even silence takes work when you are fighting memories that claw at you in the dark. Once, after my father made a passing joke about me living off taxpayers, I excused myself and went to the bathroom. I stared at my reflection under harsh light. My face was older than I remembered. Lines etched deep around my eyes, not from age, but from years of squinting against desert glare and from sleepless nights cataloging every loss. I pressed my palms to the sink, breathing slow, trying to remind myself I was here, I was home, I was not back there. I came out, forced a smile, and took my seat again. It was easier to let them believe their version of me. Easier to nod along as they built the story that I was the weak one, the one who never measured up. I could live with their misunderstanding. What I could not live with was betraying the oath I had taken. My work was classified for a reason. If I could not tell the full truth, I would tell nothing at all. Still, each dinner chipped away at me. I kept showing up because I thought that was what daughters did. I brought pies, carried gifts, wrapped presents, sat through conversations that left me raw. I showed up because a part of me still hoped for recognition, for a moment when someone would see past the surface. But most nights I left feeling more invisible than when I arrived. The irony was that they leaned on me more than they admitted. My brother once called late at night when a bill came due that he could not pay. He spoke fast, embarrassed, but desperate. I transferred the money without a word. My sister asked me to tutor her daughter when grades began to slip, saying no one else had the patience. I came every week, teaching math problems and wiping tears. My parents leaned on me when hospital bills piled up, when insurance faltered, when errands became too heavy. They all needed me, but they never saw me. I often thought of the empty chairs at the table, how some were filled with pride and some with stories, and how mine was filled with silence. It reminded me of the soldiers we lost overseas, of the empty chairs in mess halls, the spaces left behind by men who would never come home. The silence at my family table echoed those losses in a different way, a quieter kind of grief. I wondered sometimes what it would take to change their view. A medal pinned to my chest, a headline in a paper, a ceremony with applause, but the truth was I had already lived my proof. I had carried lives in my hands. I had stitched torn flesh under fire. I had written reports that saved men I would never meet. I did not need their applause. Still, the longing for it pressed heavy on me like a weight I could not set down. One night, as I left my parents' house after another dinner, my father's words followed me out the door. He had said it lightly, almost as a joke, but it cut deep. Some of us serve and some of us just sit. I drove home in silence, hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Outside the window, the world looked ordinary. Streetlights flickered, neighbors walked dogs, children rode bikes in the fading sun. But inside me, the war still raged. I replayed his words again and again until they became a chant. Some serve, some sit, some serve, some sit. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had made a choice. I would not waste breath trying to explain. I would let them believe what they wanted. Because one day I told myself the truth would rise whether they asked for it or not. And when that day came, the silence I had carried all these years would speak louder than anything I could have said. That was the beginning of the fracture, the moment when I realized that the table where I had grown up no longer had a place for me. I kept showing up, I kept sitting, but in my heart the chair was already empty. What I did not know then was that this emptiness would not last forever. The day would come when one single gesture would shatter their illusions, when silence would finally give way to truth. The human mind is strange in the way it keeps what it should let go and lets go of what it should keep. My family remembers me as the quiet daughter, the one who never quite made it, the one they could mock with easy jokes. What they do not remember, because they never knew, is that I once knelt in sand that ran dark with blood and held a man's life in my hands until it slipped away. His name was Daniel Hayes, Navy corpsman, 26 years old, father of two. We had laughed over stale coffee in the mornings, trading stories of home. He had a boy who loved baseball and a little girl who wore pigtails. He carried pictures folded so many times that the edges were soft like cloth. He talked about the house he wanted to buy when he got back, a place with a yard big enough for a swing set. The explosion came fast. One minute we were running a triage line outside Fallujah, the next the ground split open. Smoke and fire tearing through the night. I remember the blast knocking me flat, ears ringing, the world spinning. When I pushed myself up, I saw him lying in the dust, chest torn open, eyes wide with shock. Training takes over in those moments. I crawled to him, dragging my kit, ignoring the sting of shrapnel in my arm. I pressed my hands to his chest, trying to stop the flood of blood. I talked to him, low and steady, telling him to hold on. That he would see his kids again. His hand found mine and gripped so tightly I thought my bones would break. I worked until my arms trembled, until sweat and blood blurred together, until the medic beside me shook his head. I begged Daniel to stay, whispered promises into the sand, but his eyes closed and the grip loosened and he was gone. I sat there long after, my hands still pressed to his chest as if I could will the life back into him. I knew the protocols. I knew when it was over, but I could not bring myself to let go. That night marked me, not with scars the eye could see, but with something deeper. Every time I hear laughter around the family table, I think of Daniel's children. Every time someone mocks me for being lazy, I remember the weight of his body in my arms and the silence that followed. My family will never know that part of me. To them, I came home whole. They never saw the way I carried grief folded into every breath. Yet while they erased my sacrifices, I gave back in ways they never noticed. My military paychecks went toward my parents' mortgage when times were lean. Later, the research grants I received helped cover my mother's hospital bills when cancer treatments stretched beyond what insurance allowed. When my niece needed tuition, it was my savings that quietly filled the gap. I gave without fanfare because service had taught me that real giving is silent. Still, none of it counted in their eyes. They spoke as if my brother was the provider, as if my sister and her husband carried the family name. They told stories of how much they had given, how much they had done. No one spoke of the bills paid by my hand. No one spoke of the nights I drove my mother to appointments, waiting in sterile rooms while she was treated. They chose to write me out of the story, to erase me even from the ledger of gratitude. The cruelest erasure came not in silence but in ridicule. One night at a dinner celebrating my brother's commendation, wine flowed freely. Stories were told with laughter, glasses raised again and again. Then my brother, flushed with pride and drink, leaned across the table and fixed his eyes on me. "Some of us serve this country," he said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Others just spend the taxpayers' money." The words cut deeper than shrapnel ever did. A few people laughed awkwardly. My father smirked, not correcting him. My mother looked down at her plate. My sister tilted her glass, lips pursed, saying nothing. I wanted to shout at him, to tell him that I had spent nights stitching men back together under fire, that the taxpayers' money he mocked was the very reason he still had a sister sitting at that table. I wanted to tell him about Daniel Hayes, about the dozens of others who lived because of the protocols we developed in labs like mine, but I said nothing. Silence had become my uniform in civilian life. Silence kept me safe, kept me from betraying secrets, kept me from reliving memories I could barely stand in the quiet of my own apartment. So I smiled, a small bitter curve of lips, and let him think he had won. Later that night, as I drove home, I thought about the word useless. That was the word he had thrown at me once before, half in jest, half in cruelty. Useless. I wondered if he would think Daniel Hayes would call me useless. I wondered if the soldiers who walked because I held pressure on their wounds, who lived because I cut into flesh fast enough, would call me useless. The answer was clear, but it gave me little comfort. Because sometimes the voices around you drown out the truth you know inside. In the weeks after my brother's words, I tried to bury myself deeper in my work. The lab became more than a job, it was my shelter. I could lose myself in rows of samples, in the steady hum of equipment, in data that told stories stripped of emotion. Numbers never mocked me, formulas never laughed, science was clean in a way human hearts rarely were. But even there, ghosts found me. A vial slipping from my hand sent glass shattering across the floor. And suddenly I was back in a field hospital, hearing metal split apart under fire. The smell of antiseptic on my gloves pulled me into memory. A coworker calling my name too loudly made my heart pound as if mortars had struck. I learned to hide it, to smile and excuse myself when the memories grew too sharp, to steady my breathing before anyone noticed. At night, silence was the worst enemy. I would lie in the dark, staring at the ceiling, replaying the explosion that took Daniel Hayes, replaying the voices of those I saved and those I lost. And in the background, like a cruel refrain, I heard my brother's voice again. Some of us serve, and some of us just spend the taxpayers' money. I wanted to believe his words did not matter, but words from strangers glance off the skin. Words from family pierce the bone. Still, I kept giving. When my mother's treatment bills stacked high, I transferred money quietly, never asking for it back. When my niece applied to college, I helped with her essays, wrote checks for books, encouraged her even when her own parents were too busy. When my father's old truck finally died, it was me who arranged the loan, who made sure he had wheels again. I gave and gave because giving was what I knew. In uniform, you give everything and ask nothing. Out of uniform, I had no other way to live, but they remembered none of it. One summer evening, my sister hosted a garden party to celebrate her husband's latest promotion. The yard was strung with white lights, tables set with fine china, guests dressed in uniforms and cocktail dresses. I wore a simple navy dress, the only one that fit me after years of living in scrubs. I found a seat near the edge where I could breathe, where I could see the exit. The evening followed its usual rhythm. Toasts were raised, stories told. Laughter swelling with each glass of wine. Pride glowed from every corner of the yard. My sister clung to her husband's arm, radiant with borrowed glory. My father beamed at my brother, whose police commendation had made the local news. And then, as always, eyes turned to me. "So, Evelyn, what is it you do with your days now?" I repeated the same answer: biomedical research. My voice was calm, practiced. I could have been reading from a script, but that night my brother did not let it go. He lifted his glass, looked straight at me, and smiled the way a wolf does before it bares its teeth. "To those who serve," he said, his voice carrying across the tables, "and to those who spend what others have earned." The guests laughed, some uncomfortably, some too easily. My father chuckled. My sister shook her head, murmuring something about brothers being brothers. My mother looked down at her plate. I felt my chest tighten as if a hand had wrapped around my ribs. I swallowed, forcing a smile that felt carved in stone. I raised my own glass, but my hand shook so hard I had to set it down before the wine spilled. In that moment, Daniel's face returned to me. The feel of his hand gripping mine, the sound of his last breath, the silence that followed. I thought of all the men whose lives had ended in my hands and all the ones who had walked away because of the work I had done. I thought of the bills paid, the hospital rides driven, the essays written, the children comforted. And I thought of how, in this single yard filled with laughter and light, I was erased again. That night when I returned home, I did not turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, feeling the weight of every silence that had ever been placed on me. My brother's words echoed louder than gunfire, not because they were true, but because they had been spoken in front of so many, because my family had chosen not to correct him. In their silence, they agreed with him. It is a strange thing to realize that you can give your life in service and still be considered nothing by the people who should know you best. It is stranger still to feel that your sacrifices, though countless, have been erased. That night I whispered Daniel's name into the dark. Hayes, you knew the cost. Maybe that was enough. But even as I said it, I wondered how much longer I could carry the weight of erasure. Invitations are a strange thing. They can feel like doors opening or like reminders of how little you matter. When the envelope arrived for my sister's husband's promotion party, it was folded in with bills and advertisements, with no handwritten note, no call to follow. My name was printed, formal and distant, as though someone had remembered at the last minute to include me. It was not the first time. I had grown used to being invited out of obligation, as though family ties required it, but affection did not. I thought about ignoring it, about sparing myself another night of quiet humiliation. But obligation has its own pull. In the end, I ironed the only good dress I owned and told myself I could endure a few hours. The venue was a banquet hall draped in flags and polished silver. Officers in dress uniforms moved easily through the crowd, medals catching the light, laughter swelling like a tide. Civilians in cocktail dresses clutched glasses of wine and leaned in to hear stories of deployments and commands. The air was thick with pride, with recognition. I found a place near the back, a small round table pushed close to the wall. From there I could see everything and be seen by no one. That had become my habit, to exist at the edge, to let others take the spotlight. I folded my hands in my lap and tried to slow the rhythm of my heart. My family moved easily among the guests. My father clapped backs, his voice booming with stories of his own days in the Corps. My mother smiled graciously, ever the hostess even when the party was not hers. My brother shook hands, proud to be among military men though his badge was of another kind. My sister glittered in a gown that likely cost more than my rent, radiant beside her husband who stood tall in his new rank. When my eyes met hers, she gave me a smile polite enough but distracted, already turning back to her circle. I was a guest in name only. Dinner was served at long tables, the kind meant for toasts and speeches. I slipped into a chair at the end, grateful for the cover of conversation around me. Plates clinked, glasses filled, silverware rang. Stories circled the table, tales of missions and near misses, of leadership and endurance. I listened quietly, taking in the cadence of voices that felt both familiar and foreign. Then came the moment I had learned to dread. My brother leaned back in his chair, eyes bright with wine and pride. He gestured broadly toward my sister's husband. At least one person in this family has built a real career, he said. The words were sharp, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who knew exactly where to strike. A few guests chuckled. My father smirked and nodded. My mother shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I felt every eye on me, waiting for my reaction. I forced a smile. My hand tightened around the stem of my glass, but I lifted it in a mock toast, pretending the barb had not landed. Inside, though, the words cut deep, real career. As though the years I had spent in uniform, the nights in battlefield tents, the research I poured myself into meant nothing. As though my life had been a placeholder for others' glory. I had grown accustomed to their dismissal, but in that moment the sting felt fresh. It pressed against every scar I carried, every silence I had swallowed. I lowered my gaze to my plate and told myself to endure just a little longer. Then the music shifted. The clinking of silver quieted. A murmur moved through the room as my sister's husband entered, his new rank freshly stitched, his uniform sharp. He carried himself with the ease of someone accustomed to ceremony, but his eyes searched the room as though looking for something more. I sat still, waiting for the applause that usually greeted such entrances, but before anyone could begin, he stopped, his gaze locked on me. For a moment I thought I imagined it, that he had looked past me, at someone else, but then with measured steps he came closer. He halted in front of my table, shoulders squared, heels clicking together, and then he saluted. It was not a casual gesture, not the half-hearted wave of someone appeasing a relative. It was sharp, precise, deliberate. His hand rose to his brow, held steady, eyes locked on mine. The kind of salute that carries weight, that speaks of recognition earned, of honor given. The room went silent, forks stilled. Laughter died mid-breath. All around, guests froze, their eyes widening as they followed his gaze to me. I felt the breath catch in my chest. For a heartbeat I could not move. My hand trembled where it rested in my lap. 1,000 memories flooded through me, the sand, the blood, the endless nights of work unseen. And here, in this single moment, someone saw me. Slowly, instinctively, I rose. My body remembered what my heart had forgotten. I stood, heels together, back straight, and returned the salute. My hand touched my brow, crisp and unwavering, though inside I shook with emotion. For that brief eternity, it was just the two of us, soldier to soldier, recognition without words. When he lowered his hand, the silence in the room remained heavy and electric. My father stared, eyes wide, as though seeing me for the first time. My mother's hand fluttered at her chest. My brother's smirk faltered, lips parting with shock. My sister watched with something unreadable in her gaze. A question she had never thought to ask. I sat down slowly, my hands still trembling, heart pounding in my chest. He moved on then, greeting others, accepting applause and congratulations. But something had shifted. The room, once dismissive, now carried a different weight. Whispers rippled through the guests. Eyes flicked toward me, no longer dismissive, but curious, even respectful. I had not asked for this. I had not sought it. But for the first time in years, I felt seen. After the salute, the room tried to resume its rhythm, but it never quite did. Voices picked up again, glasses clinked, but the cadence was off, like music with a skipped beat. I felt the shift in the air, the way people glanced toward me and quickly away, the way silence trailed just a little too long after my name was mentioned. I sat very still, as if any movement would break the fragile moment that had passed between me and my brother-in-law. My hands trembled under the table, hidden in my lap, but my spine stayed straight. Years of training had taught me how to sit through chaos, how to keep my face calm even as my heart thundered. My father broke the silence first. He cleared his throat, louder than necessary, and launched into another story from his Marine days. His voice boomed, commanding attention, but I noticed the edge in it. He was filling space, drowning out the questions no one dared to ask. My mother nodded too quickly, offering smiles that didn't quite reach her eyes. I caught her looking at me once, her expression softer than I remembered, as though she were replaying the salute in her mind. My brother, usually quick with jabs, grew quiet. He pushed food around his plate, his jaw tight. The smirk he carried so easily was gone. I wondered if he was angry at being silenced without a word, or if he was wrestling with something deeper, something he had never allowed himself to imagine about me. And my sister. She watched me with a look I could not name, not anger, not pity, but something closer to confusion, maybe even guilt. Her husband had lifted me into the light with a single gesture, and now she seemed to be seeing me in a way she had never tried before. I kept my eyes down, tracing the rim of my glass with a fingertip. The memory of his salute played on a loop in my mind. The sharpness of it, the precision, the respect. It had been years since I had been acknowledged in that way. Years since anyone had looked at me not as a burden, but as someone who had carried weight too heavy for words. The speeches began. Guests rose to praise my brother-in-law, to recount missions and leadership, to applaud his new rank. He accepted it all with grace, his posture steady, his smile humble. But when he spoke, his first words were not about himself. "I want to thank the people who taught me what leadership truly means," he said. "And I want to acknowledge those whose service does not always make the papers, whose sacrifices are not always visible." His eyes flicked toward me just for a second. No one else seemed to notice, but I felt it like a spark in my chest. The applause rose again, but this time it felt different. For the first time in my life, I was not just the shadow at the edge of the room. When the formalities ended, guests scattered into smaller groups. Laughter and chatter filling the corners again. I stayed in my seat, unsure of what to do with the shift in the air. A woman in uniform passed by and nodded to me, a small gesture of recognition. A retired officer I had never met shook my hand, his grip firm, his eyes steady. "Thank you for your service," he said simply before moving on. Each gesture was small, but they felt monumental. For years I had been invisible, and now the veil had lifted, if only a little. Eventually, my brother-in-law found me. He slipped into the empty chair beside me, his uniform crisp, his presence calm. For a moment we sat in silence, the hum of the room around us. Then he said quietly, "I wanted them to see you." I swallowed hard, my throat ached with unshed tears. "Why?" I asked, though the word came out barely above a whisper. "Because I know," he said, "I know what you did, I know what you carried." I stared at him, heart pounding. How could he know? My work had been classified, my missions sealed. He explained in fragments, careful with his words. He had served alongside men who had lived because of the medical protocols I helped design. He had read after-action reports that traced survival rates back to the techniques we developed. He could not share details any more than I could, but he knew enough to understand the weight of what I had done. "You saved more lives than you'll ever be told," he said. "They may never give you a medal for it, but people like me, we know." My vision blurred. I blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall here in front of everyone. I nodded, unable to speak. He touched the table lightly, a gesture of reassurance, then stood to rejoin the crowd. But before he left, he said one last thing. "You've carried silence long enough. Tonight, I wanted your family to carry some of it too." When he was gone, I sat frozen. His words sank deep, mingling with years of silence, years of dismissal. My father's booming voice no longer drowned it out. My brother's smirks no longer held weight. For the first time, I felt the burden shift just slightly. The rest of the evening blurred. Conversations drifted around me, laughter rose and fell, but I was somewhere else, caught between memory and revelation. I thought of Daniel Hayes. I thought of the soldiers whose lives had hinged on a single stitch, a single vial, a single decision in the field. I thought of every night I had wondered if it had mattered, if anyone would ever know. And now, in the most unexpected way, someone had told me it did. When the party ended, I walked out into the night air. The stars were bright, sharp against the dark. I stood for a long moment, breathing deep, letting the cool air settle my racing heart. Behind me, the hall emptied, voices fading. Ahead of me, the night stretched wide, full of unknowns. I drove home in silence, the road lit by headlights and moonlight. My father's house, my brother's laughter, my sister's glow, all of it felt far away now. Like scenes from another life. What stayed with me was the salute, crisp and unwavering. The kind of recognition that cannot be undone. That night, lying in bed, I realized something. The salute had not erased the years of erasure. It had not undone the wounds left by silence and mockery, but it had cracked something open. For the first time, I believed that maybe the truth would find its way out, that maybe I did not have to live forever unseen. I closed my eyes. And for once, sleep came without the battlefield. The night after the promotion party stayed with me like a dream I could not quite shake. The crisp echo of that salute lived in my bones, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces of my family as they froze in silence. For years, I had carried the weight of their indifference, and in a single gesture, my brother-in-law had tilted the scales. I half expected the moment to fade, for things to return to the usual rhythm of dismissive jokes and ignored contributions. But the very next day, a quiet knock came at my apartment door. I opened it to find my brother-in-law standing there in civilian clothes, his expression steady but softer than I had ever seen. He asked if he could come in. I nodded, stepping aside, though my stomach nodded with unease. The silence stretched as he looked around the modest apartment, his eyes lingering on the shelves of medical journals and the framed photographs of my unit. Finally, he sat down at the kitchen table and motioned for me to join him. "I owe you an explanation," he said, his voice low. I folded my hands together, waiting. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I know about the field protocols you helped create in Fallujah. I know about the emergency surgical procedures you pioneered, the way you trained medics to stabilize catastrophic injuries long enough for a vac. I have men in my squadron who are alive today because of those methods." The room spun for a moment. I had lived so long in silence, in secrecy, that hearing the words spoken aloud felt surreal. "How?" I asked, my voice breaking. "How could you know that?" He explained in careful pieces. Reports circulate within branches, often stripped of names, but he had connected dots through colleagues and after-action briefings. He had pieced together enough to realize that the anonymous Navy surgeon who had written protocols was me. "You changed the numbers," he said simply. "Survival rates doubled in certain scenarios, and those numbers have names: Evelyn, fathers, sons, friends. That salute last night was for them as much as for you." My chest ached with the weight of his words. For years I had questioned if what I did mattered, if the silence around my service erased the truth. And here was someone telling me it had mattered more than I could measure. "I can't tell them," I whispered. "I know," he replied, "and I won't. Some things must remain classified, but I could not stand by while your own family called you useless. I wanted them to feel even a fraction of the respect you deserve." We sat in quiet for a long time. The The hum of the refrigerator filled the space, the ordinary sound of life contrasting with the extraordinary truth he had laid bare. Before he left, he paused at the door. "They'll have questions now," he said. "You don't owe them answers, but you deserve their silence to be broken. Remember that." When he was gone, I sank into the chair and buried my face in my hands. Tears slipped through my fingers, hot and relentless. Not because I wanted glory, not because I craved recognition, but because for the first time someone had seen the invisible weight I had carried. That weekend my sister called. Her voice was hesitant, uncharacteristically unsure. After the small talk dissolved, she asked the question I had been dreading. "What did you really do over there?" I closed my eyes, the ache in my chest deepening. The memories pressed against me. The smell of blood and sand, the sound of a young man's last breath. "Things I cannot tell you," I said finally. There was silence on the line. "So it's true," she whispered. I did not answer. I did not need to. She exhaled slowly. "I wish I had known. I wish we had not." Her voice trailed off, heavy with regret. "It doesn't matter," I said softly, though we both knew it did. For the first time, she did not rush to fill the silence. She let it linger, raw and unspoken. Before finally saying goodbye, that night I sat by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. My life had been built around silence, but now cracks had formed in the wall. They wanted answers, but all I could give them was silence wrapped in dignity. Yet deep inside, for the first time, I felt less alone. The week after the promotion party stretched like a taut wire. I felt it in the spaces between conversations, in the pauses too long to be casual, in the sudden way family members seemed to weigh their words around me. For years they had dismissed me without thought, but now there was hesitation and unease they could not shake. My sister called twice more, each time circling questions she wanted to ask but could not bring herself to voice. She tried to cover the silence with updates about her children or neighborhood gossip, but her voice wavered, and I could tell she was carrying a weight she had never held before, doubt. Doubt about her own judgment, about the story she had been telling herself about me all these years. My brother, on the other hand, reacted differently. He grew sharper, more defensive. At Sunday dinner, he tossed barbed comments with the same casual cruelty as before. But now there was an edge of desperation in them. "Well, at least some of us don't have to hide behind secrets," he muttered once, loud enough for the table to hear. I didn't answer. I kept my fork steady, my eyes on my plate, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a rise. Silence had always been my shield, and now it was sharper than any retort. My father, though, was the one who unsettled me most. He said little. But I caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. His marine pride had always been a fortress, impenetrable and rigid. He measured worth in medals and public recognition, in stories retold 100 times. My service, veiled in classification and quiet sacrifice, had never fit into his definition of honor, but now he seemed to struggle with something he could not name. His eyes lingered longer, as if he were trying to reconcile the daughter he had dismissed with the soldier his son-in-law had saluted. One evening he stopped by unannounced. He stood on my porch, his cap in his hands, his posture stiff but uncertain. For a moment I thought he might turn and leave, but then he cleared his throat and asked if he could come in. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with things unsaid. He looked around at the photographs lining my shelves, faces of my unit, desert landscapes. Moments frozen in time. His eyes lingered on one photo in particular, me and Daniel Hayes, side by side, grinning with exhaustion after a grueling rotation. Was he, my father's voice caught, and he had to start again. Was he one of yours? The question pierced deeper than I expected. I nodded, my throat tight. He was my closest friend, I said softly. My father's jaw clenched. He sat back, staring at the picture for a long moment. "I had men like that," he murmured, "ones you never forget." Silence stretched again, but this time it was different. It was not dismissive, it was searching. Finally, he looked at me. "Your brother-in-law told me enough to know I was wrong. I raised you to believe that honor was something earned in the open, in the stories people told about you. But I forgot that the hardest fights are often the ones no one sees." I felt my chest tighten. All the years of silence, of aching for even a sliver of recognition, pressed against me. "I never needed medals," I said, my voice shaking. "I just needed my family not to treat me like I was nothing." He winced, as if the words struck him harder than a blow. For the first time in my life, I saw my father's pride falter. "I thought I was protecting you," he said quietly, By holding you to the same standard I held myself, I didn't realize I was breaking you instead. Tears stung my eyes. I blinked hard, unwilling to let them fall. I'm not broken, I whispered. He nodded slowly. No, you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. The admission hung in the air, fragile and raw. It was not an apology, not exactly. But it was the closest my father had ever come, and in that moment it was enough. Over the next few weeks, the ripple effects of that night continued. My mother began calling more often, her voice warmer, laced with questions about my work that she had never bothered to ask before. She did not pry into classified details, but she listened when I spoke of the young veterans I mentored, of the research projects I quietly supported. My sister invited me to her children's school recital, a first in years. She hugged me afterward, holding on longer than usual, as if the gesture could make up for lost time. Even my brother grew quieter. He still bristled with defensiveness, but his jabs lost their sting. Sometimes I caught him looking at me with something like uncertainty, as though he was beginning to question the foundation of his superiority. And my father, he never spoke of that night again. But his actions shifted. He showed up at my apartment with groceries unasked. He fixed the squeaky hinge on my front door. Small gestures, but each one spoke louder than words. One evening, as he was leaving, he paused at the door. "When you're ready," he said, his voice gruff, "I'd like to hear what you can tell me, not the classified parts, just the parts a father should know about his daughter." I swallowed hard, my heart aching with both gratitude and grief. "Maybe someday," I said. He nodded, tipping his cap before stepping into the night. That night I sat by the window again, watching the city lights blur through my tears. The truth was not fully out, and perhaps it never would be. But the walls of silence had cracked, and for the first time I felt air rushing through the fractures. The salute had started it. My brother-in-law's words had given it form, but it was my own quiet strength that carried it forward. I had held my ground, and slowly, piece by piece, my family was beginning to see me. For years I had been erased, rewritten as useless, invisible. Now, even without full knowledge, they could no longer deny that I carried something deeper, something that did not need their approval to exist. And for the first time in my life, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The weeks after my father's visit unfolded with a gentler rhythm than I had known in years. For the first time, my phone buzzed with messages that were not accusations or obligations, but tentative gestures toward reconciliation. My sister sent photos of her children, asking if I might come to a school play. My mother wrote short notes about the garden she was tending, mentioning how the tulips reminded her of the years when I was small. Even my brother, usually sharp and biting, texted once with a clipped message that read, "Only hope you are well." I read each message carefully, weighing them not with suspicion, but with a quiet clarity. I understood now that their attempts were not about erasing the years of silence or making up for the things they had said. They were simply trying, in their own limited way, to step toward me. I did not need their gestures to validate me. I no longer craved proof. But I could accept them for what they were, imperfect threads of connection, fragile yet sincere. In the past, I would have answered with eagerness, desperate for their recognition. Now I chose my responses with patience, offering kindness without surrendering the ground I had earned. When my sister asked if I would attend the play, I said yes, but not because I needed her approval. I went because I wanted to see her children, to share in their joy. It was the first time I walked into her world not as the shadow of a failure, but as myself. Beyond family, my life began to take shape in ways I had long postponed. I accepted an invitation to teach a class on battlefield medicine for younger veterans training to serve as EMTs. The first day I stood in front of them, I felt the old weight of command settle on my shoulders, not with fear, but with purpose. Their faces reminded me of my own when I was 20, carrying both hope and dread in equal measure. I taught them not only techniques but truths, how to steady your hands when adrenaline threatens to shake them loose, how to hear the sound of incoming fire and still focus on the wound before you, how to make peace with the decisions that will haunt you. Some of them listened with the hungry eyes of those who would soon see battle. Others absorbed the lessons with the gravity of men and women who already had. After class, a young woman lingered behind. She was no older than 22, her uniform crisp, her eyes shadowed with something I recognized all too well. She asked me quietly if the fear ever went away. I looked at her for a long moment before answering. "No," I said gently, "but you learn to carry it, and sometimes it teaches you what matters most." She nodded, tears threatening to spill, and I knew then that my purpose was not gone with my discharge. It had only shifted. My battlefield had changed, but the mission remained. I poured myself into that work, not because it erased the past, but because it honored it. Each class, each conversation felt like another step toward reclaiming the parts of me I had been forced to bury. I was not invisible anymore, not to myself, not to the people I was guiding. One afternoon, after a long day of teaching, I came home to find a letter waiting in my mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable, shaky but firm, my father's. My hands trembled as I carried it inside. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where my brother-in-law had once told me he knew my truth, and I opened the envelope. The words inside were simple, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. "I do not know all that you have carried," my father wrote, "but that night when I saw him salute you, I realized I had been blind. I thought I knew what strength looked like. I thought I knew what service meant. I was wrong. You have borne more than I ever gave you credit for. I cannot undo what I said. But I can tell you now that I see you, and I am proud to be your father." I set the letter down, tears blurring the ink. I had told myself for years that I did not need his apology, and perhaps I truly did not. But the letter was not just an apology. It was an acknowledgement, a lifting of the silence that had wrapped itself around us. It was not perfection, but it was enough. That night I slept with the letter beside my bed, for the first time in years. I did not dream of Fallujah, of blood and sand and the endless echo of loss. Instead, I dreamed of light breaking through a window, illuminating a table where no chair sat empty. I understood then that forgiveness was not about absolution. It was about release. I did not have to forget the years of dismissal or erase the wounds of silence, but I could choose to let go of the need to prove myself. I could live my life not as a shadow of what others believed me to be, but as the whole of who I was. I was Evelyn Carter. I had worn the uniform of the United States Navy. I had carried lives in my hands, saved some, lost others, and borne the weight of both. My family might never know the full extent of what that meant, but I knew, and that was enough. The letter from my father sat on the table for weeks, edges curling from the touch of my hands. I read it more times than I cared to admit. Each time it felt like a weight shifting, subtle but undeniable. For years I had carried the ache of his disappointment, the sharp sting of his silence. Now, though, I had something I never thought I would receive, his recognition, fragile but real. It did not change the past. The years of mockery and dismissal could not be erased with a few words, but the letter opened a door, one I had already started to walk through long before he sent it. It was the door to a life I chose for myself, a life built not on the need for approval, but on the quiet certainty of purpose. Teaching grew into more than a part-time role. I found myself staying late after classes, answering questions, guiding veterans through not just techniques, but the invisible scars that never quite healed. Many came with the same haunted look I carried for years, the same burden of memories that clawed through the dark. With them, I spoke plainly, not as an officer or an instructor, but as someone who knew the language of loss. One young man told me about the friend he could not save. His words tumbled out, jagged and desperate, like shrapnel tearing through the air. I listened, steady and silent, until his voice broke. Then I told him about Daniel Hayes. I told him about holding his hand as the blast smoke still hung heavy, about whispering that he was not alone even as I felt the life slipping from him. The room was quiet after that, his eyes wide, his breathing ragged, but then something softened. He nodded, and I knew that sharing the truth of my pain had given him permission to lay down some of his own. These were the moments that filled me now. Not applause, not medals, but the steady hum of connection between those who had seen too much and carried too much. My classroom became less about medicine and more about survival of the soul. Outside of teaching, I gave my time to the community. At the local VA clinic, I volunteered to sit with those waiting long hours for appointments, sometimes just talking, sometimes just sitting in silence. For some, that silence was the balm they needed most. There was a woman I met there, older, her hands trembling from years of arthritis. She told me she had been a nurse in Vietnam, that she had patched wounds with little more than gauze and grit. She laughed softly when she heard my story, shaking her head. Different war, same silence, she said. No one ever wants to hear it until it's too late. Her words stayed with me. Different war, same silence. Yet I realized that the silence did not have to remain the same. It could change, it could shift, depending on how I chose to carry it. I thought often about that night at the promotion party, about the salute that cracked open the wall I had lived behind, about the look in my father's eyes when he admitted he had been wrong, about the text messages from my brother, the photos from my sister, the small ways my mother tried to draw me closer. They were not enough to rewrite the story of who I was, but they did not need to be, because for the first time in my life, I no longer measured myself by their recognition. I found myself enjoying small things again. Morning coffee by the window, watching the city wake. Walks through the park where I let myself breathe deeply, noticing the play of light through the leaves. Dinners with a few fellow veterans where laughter came easier than it once had. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less often. And when they did, I woke with a steadiness I had not known before, reminding myself that I had built a life beyond the battlefield. One spring afternoon, I was invited to speak at a small community event honoring veterans. The organizers wanted someone who could talk not about glory, but about resilience. I hesitated at first, the idea of standing at a podium uncomfortable, almost foreign. But then I remembered the young woman who had asked me if fear ever went away. I remembered the boyish face of the man who had told me he could not save his friend. I remembered the Vietnam nurse and her shaking hands. I agreed. The hall was modest, filled with folding chairs and the faint smell of coffee brewing in the back. The audience was a mix of veterans, families, and young cadets. When I stepped to the podium, my heart raced, but my voice, when it came, was steady. I did not speak of battles or numbers. I spoke of silence. I spoke of what it means to carry wounds no one sees, of the strength it takes to keep walking when the world insists you are invisible. I told them that the hardest victories are not always the ones won with medals, but the ones fought in the quiet corners of our lives. When I finished, there was no thunderous applause. Instead, there was a hush, a weight of understanding that settled over the room. And then slowly people stood, not clapping wildly, but standing with the same solemn respect as a salute. I bowed my head, my chest tight with gratitude. That was enough. Later that evening, as I walked home beneath the fading light, I thought about the silence I had once dreaded. For years it had been forced on me, a cage built of secrecy and dismissal. But now it was different. Now silence was something I chose, a shield and a strength. I no longer needed to fill it with explanations or apologies. I could let it stand dignified, a testament to what I had endured and who I had become. At home, I placed my father's letter in a small wooden box along with my service pins and a few photographs, not to lock them away, but to keep them safe. They were part of me, but they did not define all of me. I sat by the window, the city lights flickering in the distance, and allowed myself to breathe deeply. My life was not perfect. The scars were still there. The losses would never fade, but I had found a way to live with them, to build something meaningful from their weight. And in that quiet, I understood something I had been chasing for years. I did not need vindication. I did not need recognition. What I needed was peace. Silence had once been my prison. Now it was my freedom. I used to believe that my worth depended on the people sitting around my family's table. I thought if I could just earn their approval, if I could make them see me, then maybe the silence I carried would finally lift. But the truth is, my value was never theirs to give or to take away. It was there in the moments when I kept a soldier alive long enough to see his child's face again. It was there in the nights when I stitched hope into broken bodies, knowing the outcome was uncertain but refusing to give up. My worth lived in the grit it took to steady my hands when fear threatened to shake them loose, and in the quiet courage of showing up again and again, even when no one was watching. That salute at the promotion party did not erase the years of being overlooked, and it was not about revenge. It was about recognition, not from my family, but from someone who understood what sacrifice costs. It was about being seen, if only for a moment, by another soul who knew the weight of carrying lives in silence. Sometimes one simple gesture can cut through years of dismissal, reminding us that respect does not need to be shouted to be real. I have learned that a silent salute can speak louder than any explanation, louder than any defense. It tells a story of shared sacrifice, of battles fought in shadows, of the unseen price of service. and it carries a truth no argument can undo. So if you are listening now and you have ever felt invisible, if you have been told that you are not enough, hold this close. Your worth does not come from their applause or their approval. It is already written in the way you endure, in the love you give, in the strength you carry through the hardest nights. No one else can define it. No one else can erase it. All it takes is believing it for yourself. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to Military Revenge. Share in the comments where you are listening from, and if you feel moved, share your own story. Not because we need sympathy, but because when we tell the truth about what we carry, we remind each other of something vital, that we are never alone.